Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little ambitious, or depending on your perspective, deeply unhinged. We're going to tour the absolute worst moments in human history. Not the kind of bad where your flight gets delayed, or the restaurant gets your order wrong. I mean the kind of bad where you wake up and the life expectancy is 35, the soup is trying to kill you, and literally everything smells like a wet goat in a burning building. We're talking plague years, ice ages, empires collapsing, famine so bad people got creative about what counted as food. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And before we go any further, a genuinely warm thank you to everyone who suggested tonight's topic. I read your comments more than you probably realise, and honestly this channel would not be what it is without you. You shape where we go and what we explore, and that means everything. If you haven't already, come find us on Spotify, the link is in the description, because apparently some of you like listening to tales of historical suffering while doing the dishes, which is deeply relatable. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan if you've got one, tuck yourself in, pull the blanket up, get warm, get still, get comfortable, because you are about to spend the next little while being very, very grateful you were born when you were. Let's pause for a second though before we dive in. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live through the Black Death? Did people just walk past bodies in the street and go about their Tuesday? Was there a point during the Bronze Age collapse where someone sat in the ruins of their civilization and thought, well, this is fine? If you were a Roman soldier in the 3rd century, sandals wet, empire crumbling, barbarians on every side, did you have any idea things were that bad, or did it just feel like a particularly rough month? What? Did medieval peasants eat in the middle of a famine when the harvest failed and the pottage ran out? Were there people in the Little Ice Age who looked outside at another 6 feet of snow in July and just thought, this seems like a lot? And what about the Bronze Age? 3,000 years before anybody invented even basic plumbing, what did a bad day actually look like? Congratulations, you're about to find out. You've just blinked awake somewhere in the long, chaotic, frequently horrifying story of human history. The year depends on where we land, but wherever we end up, one thing is certain. You did not pack enough layers, you have no antibiotics, and somebody nearby is almost definitely about to make a very bad decision that affects everyone. Welcome, let's begin. You've heard of civilizations rising and falling, but the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE is less of a fall and more of a complete and utter implosion, the kind of catastrophe that makes you want to sit down, put your head in your hands, and have a very long think about the fragility of everything. In the space of just a few decades, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Ugaritic Empire, the Egyptian New Kingdom collapsed simultaneously. Trade networks vanished. Palace economies dissolved. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned virtually overnight. Nobody sent an email explaining what happened. No grand final decree was issued. Things were fine, and then, quite suddenly, they were not. If you had gone to sleep in one of these cities in 1190 BCE, comfortable and well-fed, and woken up 20 years later, you might not have recognised the world around you. The roads were empty, the palaces were silent, the scribes had stopped writing. You would have looked around and thought, did everyone just leave? And the deeply unsettling answer is, kind of, yes. Let's set the scene more carefully. You live in Ugarit, a prosperous city on the coast of what is now Syria, a trading hub that connects Egypt to the Aegean, that exports grain and purple dye and receives copper and tin in return. Your city has walls. Your city has a king. Your city has a scribal school where young men learn to write in 4 different languages because Ugarit does business with everyone. Things are, by the standards of 1200 BCE, going reasonably well. And then the letters start arriving. Archaeologists found them, still in the kiln where they were being fired for delivery, messages from the king of Al-Ashir, which is probably Cyprus, saying that enemy ships have been spotted offshore and that cities are being burned. From the king of Ugarit himself, a message to the king of Al-Ashia. The enemy ships have come. They have burned cities and done damage in the land. There are no more supplies, no copper, no grain. The enemy advances and there is no one to help. The letter was never sent. Ugarit was destroyed shortly after. The clay tablets survived because fire, the thing that ended the city, also preserved them. Now imagine waking up in that world. Not in Ugarit at the moment of its destruction, but somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean in the years immediately following, say 1180 BCE, somewhere that used to be a functioning part of the Bronze Age trade network and now simply isn't. The specialised craftsmen who made your tools have scattered. The merchants who brought you tin from Afghanistan to mix with your copper, gone. The palace that coordinated agriculture, that told farmers what to plant and stored the surplus for lean years, empty, looted, silent. Bronze Age civilization was, in a very real sense, globalized. The palace economies were interdependent, and when one thread pulled, the whole web unravelled. What caused it? Historians argue about this with genuine passion. Possible suspects include a wave of invaders called the Sea Peoples, groups of migrants and raiders, possibly themselves displaced by earlier disasters, who appear in Egyptian records striking coastal cities across the Levant. There is also evidence of a severe and prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Agricultural failure on a scale that would have put palace economies under catastrophic pressure. Earthquakes hit several major sites in quick succession. Internal rebellions may have finished what natural disaster started. Most likely it was all of these at once, a cascading failure of the kind that doesn't have a single cause, but rather 100 small causes that would each have been manageable on their own, but arrived simultaneously and broke everything. Within a generation, writing itself largely disappeared from the region. Not because people became stupid, but because the palace bureaucracies that had maintained literacy were gone, and there was no longer a need to track grain shipments and trade inventories when there were no grain shipments and no trade. The lights went out across the Mediterranean, and they stayed out for several hundred years, a period historians soberly call the Greek Dark Ages. And somehow, on the other side of it, people rebuilt. They always do. But that is cold comfort if you're living in the middle of the collapse, watching the ships stop coming, and the grain stores run low, and the scribes pack their belongings and leave for somewhere that hopefully still exists. Egypt had a deal with the Nile. The Nile flooded every year, deposited its rich black silt across the farmland, and in return the Egyptians built temples to the gods and generally kept civilization going. It was a good arrangement. It worked for centuries. And then, around 2200 BCE, the Nile stopped cooperating. The floods failed. The harvests failed with them. And Egypt, that gleaming monument to human organization and divine favor, found itself in a situation so catastrophic it is sometimes called the First Intermediate Period, which is historian speak for things got very dark and stayed that way for a while. The central government essentially collapsed. Regional governors, called nomarchs, began hoarding grain and ruling their own little fiefdoms. Tomb inscriptions from this period, because Egyptians always found a way to write things down, even in a famine, describe scenes that sound like something out of a nightmare. People eating their own children, entire villages abandoned, the dead left unburied because there was no one left to carry them. There's one inscription from a governor named Anktifi that reads, in magnificent understatement, that he saved his district from dying of hunger while Upper Egypt starved like grasshoppers, which suggests things were, to put it mildly, not great. Here is what you need to understand about Egypt's relationship with the Nile to appreciate how completely things fell apart. The Nile's annual flood was not simply convenient. It was the entire basis of Egyptian agriculture. Egyptian economy and to a significant extent Egyptian theology. The flood deposited the rich black silt called Kemet, the Black Land, which is where Egypt gets one of its ancient names that made the otherwise desert river valley extraordinarily productive. Too little flood, not enough silt, crops fail, too much flood, irrigation systems destroyed, villages drowned, crops fail differently. The Egyptians were so dependent on the Nile's reliability that they developed a sophisticated system of nilometers, measuring devices cut into rock along the river to track the flood levels and predict the harvest months in advance. The pharaoh's divine role was partly defined by his ability to ensure the Nile flooded correctly. When it didn't, the theological implications were severe. Was the pharaoh failing the gods? Were the gods failing Egypt? Either answer was deeply destabilizing. Now wake up in this world. You are a farmer in the Delta region, sometime around 2150 BCE. Your family has farmed the same strip of black land for generations. This year, the flood came late and low. The silt deposit was thin. The wheat grew poorly. You ate less than usual through winter. The following year, the flood was low again. The grain stores from the previous good years are gone. The central government, which in better times would have organised grain distribution from the massive royal storehouses, has effectively ceased to function. The pharaoh's court is in disarray. Local governors are seizing whatever grain remains in their territories and are not sharing it with anyone. You have neighbours who are eating seed grain, the grain that should be saved for next year's planting, because they have nothing else. You understand dimly what that means for next year. Tomb inscriptions are unusually vivid about this period, which is itself telling. Egyptians generally preferred to record triumphs rather than disasters, so the fact that multiple officials felt compelled to describe the famine in detail suggests it was remarkable even by ancient standards of hardship. One inscription describes a man carrying his children to be sold as slaves in exchange for food. Another describes a man who prided himself on never sending anyone away hungry from his door, a detail that only makes sense in a world where people were regularly being sent away hungry from doors. The governor Ankhtifi, from the nome of Hierakonpolis, boasted explicitly that he had fed his people when the sky was clouded and the earth parched, and everyone in Upper Egypt was dying of hunger. He was not modest about it. In a famine, keeping people alive is worth boasting about. It may be the only thing worth boasting about. The famine lasted, in various intensities, for perhaps a century, driven by a prolonged drought across northeast Africa and the Middle East that modern climatologists have been able to confirm through ice core data, lake sediment records and geological evidence. It was not a bad season. It was a climatic shift, and it ended an era. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, the civilization that built the Great Pyramids at Giza, that produced some of the most sophisticated art and engineering of the ancient world, did not survive it intact. What came after was different, more fragmented, more uncertain. The deal with the Nile had been broken, and nothing would be quite the same again. Pompeii had a mountain. Everyone in Pompeii could see the mountain. It was large, it was dramatic, and it occasionally rumbled in a way that perhaps should have been alarming, but had become so routine that residents of the city simply got on with their lives, shopping in the forum, visiting the baths, arguing about gladiator matches, painting campaign slogans on the walls like it was election season, which it was. In fact, the city was so thoroughly, enthusiastically alive in the weeks before August the 24th, 79 CE, that the sheer normalcy of it is almost heartbreaking in retrospect. Bread was baking in the ovens, wine was being poured. A half-eaten meal was sitting on a table somewhere in a garden. And then, sometime around midday, Vesuvius announced itself with a column of ash so enormous that Pliny the Elder, watching from across the bay, described it as resembling a pine tree in its shape, tall, narrow at the base, then spreading wide across the sky. By the following morning, Pompeii was buried under meters of ash and pumice, preserved almost perfectly for nearly 2,000 years, a city frozen in its last ordinary day. To wake up in Pompeii on that morning is to experience, in the most visceral way possible, the particular horror of catastrophe arriving on a perfectly sunny Tuesday. Let's spend a moment with the morning before everything goes sideways. It is late summer. The Bay of Naples is blue and warm. Pompeii is a prosperous Roman city of perhaps 11,000 people. Not enormous by Roman standards, but busy, comfortable, with its own amphitheatre, its own forum, its own bathhouses, its own brothels with helpfully illustrated menus painted above the doors. It is 17 days after the festival of Vulcan, the god of fire, a detail future historians will note with grim irony. The streets are narrow and paved with large stones, worn smooth by cartwheels. The sidewalks are high because the streets double as drainage channels, and the pedestrians learned early to stay elevated. You can walk into a thermopolium, the Roman equivalent of a fast food counter, a stone counter with ceramic pots set into it containing hot food, and buy yourself a bowl of something warm. You can buy bread from one of the many bakeries. Archaeologists found carbonized loaves still in the ovens. They found a dog skeleton still chained near an entrance, unable to flee. They found a man who appears to have been shielding a child with his body. The preservation is so complete and so intimate that it becomes difficult after a while to think of Pompeii as an archaeological site. It feels more like an interrupted conversation. The eruption itself began mildly, as these things go. There had been earthquakes in the days before, but earthquakes were common in the region, and Pompeii had survived a significant one 17 years earlier in 62 CE and had largely rebuilt. When the column of ash appeared above Vesuvius around noon on the 24th, some residents began to leave. Others stayed, watching from rooftops, uncertain. Pliny the Younger, who was 17 at the time and watching from across the bay with his uncle, described the pumice beginning to fall like hail, light enough at first that people were holding pillows over their heads as protection. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, who commanded the Roman fleet at Misenum, sailed toward Pompeii to help with the evacuation, and died on the beach at Stabiae, overcome probably by the toxic gases, found the next morning with no marks of violence on his body looking. His nephew wrote, "More like a sleeping man than a dead one." The final act came not from the ash but from a pyroclastic surge, a wave of superheated gas and debris that rolled down the mountain slopes and hit the city at somewhere around 300 degrees Celsius. Death, for those still in Pompeii at that point, was a matter of seconds. The volcanic material then buried everything, and the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes Pompeii endlessly haunting, is that the ash preserved not just the buildings and the bodies, but the shape of the absence, the hollow left behind as organic material decomposed inside the hardened volcanic casing. When archaeologists in the 19th century began pouring plaster into these voids, they recovered not skeletons but figures, people in the exact postures they died in, faces buried in their arms, a family clustered together, a dog curled on its side. Pompeii didn't just preserve a city, it preserved a moment of being human, the last one those particular humans ever had. The Roman Empire at its height was, by ancient standards, a marvel of organisation. Roads, laws, trade, a centralised government, and the general sense that someone somewhere was in charge. Then came the 3rd century CE, and all of that rather fell apart. Between the years 235 and 284, a period historians cheerfully call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome cycled through approximately 50 emperors in 50 years. If you're doing the math, that's an average reign of about 1 year, which is not enough time to even get your portrait on the coins before someone is running at you with a sword. The currency collapsed, The borders of the empire were under constant pressure from outside. The economy tanked. Plague swept through the population repeatedly. Entire regions essentially declared independence and started running themselves, because waiting for Rome to sort out which emperor was technically real this week was taking too long. If you were a Roman citizen trying to go about your daily life during this period, running a shop, farming your land, just trying to figure out who to pay your taxes to, you would have been forgiven for sitting down on the nearest fallen column and simply staring into the middle distance for a very long time. The proximate cause of the crisis was the army, or more precisely, the army's discovery that it could make and unmake emperors. This had always been true to some extent. No Roman emperor survived long without military support, but during the 3rd century it became explicit and relentless. Generals were proclaimed emperor by their troops in the field, marched on Rome, killed the previous emperor, sat on the throne briefly, and were then killed by the next general whose troops had decided they deserved a turn. The soldiers had figured out that loyalty was a negotiable commodity with a price, and the price was donatives, cash payments distributed at accession, which meant that the quickest way to get a large cash payment was to back a new claimant, which created a feedback loop of spectacular instability. Now consider what this actually felt like if you were not an emperor but an ordinary person, a merchant in Antioch, say, or a farmer in Gaul. Every change of emperor brought uncertainty. Tax policies shifted. The currency was debased. The silver content of Roman coins was reduced steadily throughout the period, until by the 260s the Antoninianus coin contained almost no silver at all, just silver-wash bronze, which caused inflation that wiped out savings and made long-term economic planning essentially impossible. It is like discovering that the money in your wallet has been quietly replaced with increasingly convincing fakes, and that this is now official policy. The borders were the other nightmare. The Sassanid Persian Empire to the east was newly aggressive and militarily formidable. The Emperor Valerian was captured by the Sassanid king Shapur I in 260 and spent the rest of his life as a prisoner, used, according to Persian accounts, as a human mounting block when Shapur climbed onto his horse. The Romans did not enjoy commemorating this particular episode. In the north and west, Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Alemanni, the Franks, probed the Rhine and Danube frontiers continuously, occasionally breaking through. At one point in the 260s, the empire effectively split into 3: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east under the extraordinary Queen Zenobia, and a rump Roman state in the middle trying to hold things together. It managed eventually. The Emperor Aurelian reunified the empire in the 270s, earning the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But the world he restored was noticeably shakier than the one that had existed 50 years before. The crisis didn't kill Rome immediately. It just made clear that Rome could in fact be killed, and that was a thought that, once thought, could not be unthought. 1816 had a problem. The problem was that summer did not arrive, not because of anything as mundane as a particularly cloudy June, but because a year earlier, on the other side of the world, Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia erupted with a force so catastrophic it ejected enough ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to lower global temperatures by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. 3 degrees doesn't sound like much. 3 degrees is the difference between a warm spring and frost in July. 3 degrees is the difference between a harvest and a famine. In New England, snow fell in June. Crops across Europe and North America failed. Livestock died. Grain prices tripled overnight. In parts of Switzerland, people were so desperate they ate cats and whatever else they could find. The Rhine flooded. Tens of thousands of people in Europe and Asia died of starvation and the diseases that follow in its wake. And, the worst part, the part that makes this one of the great creeping horrors of the 19th century, is that for most people living through it, there was no explanation. They didn't know about Tambora. They just knew that the sky was a strange bruised colour at sunset. The cold wasn't lifting, and the rye in the fields had turned black. Let's start with Tambora itself, because it deserves a moment. The eruption in April of 1815 was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, significantly larger than Krakatoa, which gets more attention partly because it happened later, in the age of the telegraph, when the world could be informed about it immediately. Tambora ejected somewhere between 100 and 160 cubic kilometres of material into the atmosphere. The explosion was heard as far away as 2,000 kilometres. The eruption killed an estimated 71,000 people directly on the island of Sumbawa and surrounding areas through the blast itself, through pyroclastic flows, and through the famine and disease that followed as the island's agriculture was destroyed. The local Tamboran language and culture were so completely annihilated that they vanished from history almost without trace, and then the ash and sulfur dioxide entered the stratosphere and began their slow, deadly circulation around the planet. Wake up now in rural New England in the spring of 1816. You are a farmer. Winter was hard, as winters always are, but spring has arrived, and you have planted your corn and your beans and your squash in the usual way at the usual time, because the seasons seem to be progressing normally. And then in early June, frost came. Not a light frost, the kind that damages tender seedlings. Hard frost. Snow fell in parts of Vermont and Maine in June. The corn, which needs warmth, failed. People replanted, hoping for the best. In July, frost came again. In August, frost again. The growing season, which in New England is already short, effectively did not happen. Farmers who had planted in hope watched their fields go brown and dead in what should have been the height of summer. Some drove their livestock westward, into Ohio and Indiana, where things were marginally less catastrophic, and this mass migration contributed significantly to the settlement of the American Midwest, which is one of history's more unexpected silver linings. In Europe, things were worse. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended, leaving economies shattered and agricultural systems disrupted across the continent. The additional hammer blow of crop failure in 1816 tipped many regions from hardship into genuine famine. In Ireland, which would face its own far more devastating famine 30 years later, typhus swept through a population already weakened by hunger. In France and Germany, bread riots broke out. In Switzerland, the government declared a state of emergency. The strange dimmed sunsets, caused by the atmospheric particles scattering light, were beautiful in an eerie way, and they inspired art. Turner's volcanic skies, and a particularly productive summer in a villa on Lake Geneva, where a young woman named Mary Shelley, stuck indoors by the relentless cold and rain, wrote a story about a scientist who created life and then watched it destroy everything he loved. The year without a summer did not just kill crops. It killed a generation's confidence that the natural world was reliable, and it sent a signal, one that would not be properly understood for another century and a half, about just how comprehensively a single geological event could unmake the ordinary rhythms of human life. On the 8th of June, 793 CE, a group of monks on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England, were going about their mourning. Prayers had been said. The scriptorium was probably warm. Someone was copying a manuscript in careful, painstaking Latin, and then the longships appeared. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the first Viking attack on British soil, but it became the one that defined an era, the moment that announced to a stunned and horrified Christian Europe that there was something new, fast and terrifying coming out of the north. The monks had no defences, the island had no walls. It had never needed them, it was a holy place, and the general expectation in 8th century England was that holy places were left alone by virtue of being holy. The Vikings had not received this particular memo. They pillaged the monastery, killed some of the monks, dragged others away as slaves, threw some into the sea apparently just to see what would happen, and were gone before anyone could mount a response. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne when he heard the news, was so distressed he barely had words. The church of St. Cuthbert, he wrote, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. Waking up on Lindisfarne that morning, comfortable and faithful and completely unprepared, would have been the most terrifying thing imaginable. Lindisfarne was not just any monastery. It was one of the most important religious sites in the British Isles, a centre of learning, illumination, and Christian culture that had been producing extraordinary work for over a century. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created there around 715 CE, are among the most beautiful manuscripts ever made, intricate, precise, astonishing in their detail, the product of a community that had dedicated its existence to quiet scholarship and devotion. The monastery was wealthy by the standards of the time, which is precisely why it attracted attention. Viking raids were, at their most functional, economic enterprises. You went where the valuables were, you moved fast, and you left before anyone organised a response. Churches and monasteries which accumulated gold, silver and portable wealth in a way that farming villages did not were logical targets. The logic was brutal but not irrational. Now spend a moment as one of the monks. You've been on this island, which is a tidal island, accessible from the mainland only at low tide for years, possibly decades. Your days are structured by the canonical hours. You pray, you copy manuscripts, you tend the garden, you pray again. Violence is not part of your frame of reference in any immediate sense. The nearest thing to a threat you've encountered recently is probably a theological disagreement at council meeting. And then, on a June morning, men with axes come over the water faster than seems possible, and your entire world ends in a matter of minutes. No warning, no negotiation, no mercy extended on the grounds that this was a house of God, because the men arriving did not share your definition of what that meant, or why it should matter. The shock to the rest of Christian Europe cannot be overstated. Alcuin's letter is a document of genuine bewilderment. He writes of the heathens polluting the sanctuaries of God, of things unheard of from the beginning of the world. And while that's slightly dramatic, Vikings had raided before, what he was capturing was the psychological blow, the sense that nowhere was safe, that the sea itself had become a highway for violence that no one had prepared for. Lindisfarne was the moment England understood it had a new problem, and that the problem was not going to be solved with prayer alone. The Viking Age, which would reshape Britain, Ireland, France, and ultimately the entire North Atlantic world over the next 3 centuries, had officially announced itself. And it had done so with such efficiency and such speed that it was over before anyone could even decide what to do about it. The longships were already gone, and Lindisfarne was already burning. The 12 ships from the Black Sea arrived in the port of Messina, Sicily in October of 1347, and the port officials who went to greet them made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, which, for many of them, would not be very long. Most of the sailors aboard were dead. Those still alive were covered in strange black swellings at the groin and armpit, swellings that oozed blood and pus, and were visibly dying. The port officials ordered the ships out of the harbour immediately. The ships left. The plague did not. Within months it had spread from Sicily across the Italian peninsula, and within 3 years it had killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of Europe. Streets that had been bustling were empty. Whole villages were abandoned. The machinery of medieval life, the feudal system, the church's authority, the economic order, buckled under the weight of so much death so fast. Chroniclers wrote about it with a kind of stunned exhaustion, describing piles of bodies, fields left unploughed because the farmers were dead, and the particularly grim fact that, in some cities, you could not bury people fast enough to keep up. To wake up in Europe in the autumn of 1347, you would have no idea what was coming, but it was already on its way. Let's talk about the mechanics of why it spread so fast, because the Black Death was not simply bad luck. It was bad luck applied to an extraordinarily well-connected world. Medieval Europe in the mid-14th century had extensive trade routes. Italian merchant ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean constantly. Overland trade routes connected the ports to the interior. Grain, cloth, and spices moved through networks that touched almost every significant population centre. What moved along those same routes, hiding in the fur of black rats, carried by the fleas that fed on them, was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. It had come from Central Asia, travelled west along the Silk Road, reached the Crimea, and made the jump to European merchant vessels at the port of Kaffa after a rather grim episode involving Mongol forces catapulting plague-infected bodies over the city walls. The rats got on the ships, the fleas got on the rats, the ships came to Messina. Now imagine you're living in Florence in the winter of 1347 to 48. Florence is one of the great cities of Europe, wealthy, sophisticated, the home of banking families whose financial networks span the continent, the city that will in another century produce the Renaissance. You're going about your life in a city of roughly 90,000 people, and then people around you start dying. Not one or two, many, quickly. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through it and wrote about it in the introduction to the Decameron, describes the symptoms with clinical precision. First, the swellings in the armpit or groin, growing to the size of an apple or an egg, then black or livid blotches appearing on the skin, then death, usually within 3 days of the first symptoms. He describes people dying in the streets. He describes people waking up in the morning healthy and being dead before nightfall. He describes pigs rooting through the belongings of the dead in the public squares and dropping dead themselves shortly afterward. What makes the Black Death uniquely destabilising beyond the scale of the death is the speed of it and the complete failure of every existing framework to explain or contain it. Medical theory said it was caused by bad air, miasma, or by an unfortunate conjunction of the planets. Religious explanation said it was God's punishment for human sinfulness, which inspired flagellant movements across Europe, groups of people who publicly whipped themselves in the streets, hoping to atone on behalf of humanity, and in doing so spread the disease further as they travelled from city to city. Jewish communities were blamed and massacred in parts of Germany, following the logic that Jews were dying at lower rates, probably because their religious practices around cleanliness offered marginal protection, but interpreted at the time as evidence of conspiracy. None of the explanations were correct, none of the cures worked, and by the time the worst of it had passed, Europe had lost somewhere between 25 and 50 million people, and would spend the next century trying to make sense of a world that suddenly had far fewer people in it, and no idea why. Scotland's Highlands in the late 15th century were not, by anyone's estimation, the easiest place in the world to live. The terrain was unforgiving, the climate was reliably brutal, and the political situation, a patchwork of clan loyalties, feuds, and an increasingly assertive Scottish crown trying to assert control over a population that very much preferred to handle things locally, added a layer of social instability to an already challenging existence. And then the harvest failed. Not once, but repeatedly through the 1490s as part of a broader pattern of climatic cooling that was slowly tightening its grip across northern Europe. In the Highlands, where the margin between a good year and a catastrophic one was always narrow, Successive bad harvests meant famine, real, grinding, life-ending famine. People ate seed grain that should have been saved for planting, which guaranteed the next year's harvest would be worse. Cattle died. People died. The kind of death that doesn't make it into chronicles because there's no one left to write it down. To wake up in a Highland clachan in the winter of 1497, hungry, cold, and watching the last of the oat stores dwindle, would have been to confront a very particular and very quiet kind of despair. The Highland farming system in this period was called runrig, a form of shared land cultivation in which strips of arable land were distributed among the community, with common grazing areas shared by all. It was a system designed, over centuries of practice, to spread risk. In a bad year, everyone had less, but no single family was likely to have nothing while their neighbour had plenty. It was not an equitable system in the grand sense. Clan chiefs and their immediate families ate considerably better than tenant farmers, but it had a certain communal logic that made it resilient to ordinary variation in harvests. What it was not resilient to was multiple consecutive failures. The oat was the Highland staple, barley grew in some lower areas, kale was grown where possible, cattle were the main source of wealth and in extremity food, but eating your cattle was eating your capital, consuming the animals that provided milk and butter and calves and the means to plough the limited arable ground. A family that ate its cattle in winter had solved a short-term problem at the cost of making the next year essentially unworkable, and in the 1490s, with the temperature dropping and the growing season shortening and the rains arriving at precisely the wrong moments in the agricultural calendar, families across the Highlands were faced with exactly that calculation, year after year. What made it worse was the near-total absence of any external support structure. The Scottish crown was preoccupied with its own political turbulence. James IV had taken the throne in 1488 after his father James III was killed at the Battle of Saltcheburn, and the Highlands, which were remote and difficult to govern at the best of times, were not a priority. The church offered prayers. Clan chiefs who had surplus sometimes distributed it among their dependents, and the bond between chief and clansman was partly defined by exactly this kind of reciprocal obligation. But chiefs who were themselves facing poor harvests had little to give. The cold was a physical presence, the kind of damp Highland cold that gets into everything, that turns thatch to mould and mud to ice, and the already inadequate insulation of a stone-walled black house into something merely slightly less deadly than sleeping outside. Families burned peat, the Highland fuel to stay warm, and when the peat ran low they burned furniture, and when the furniture was gone they burned hope. You could see the smoke from the remaining fires thinning as the winter deepened, and in the particular silence of a Highland glen in January, the absence of smoke from a neighbour's chimney was its own kind of eulogy. In the year 1212 CE, a movement swept through parts of France and Germany that is, in retrospect, so catastrophically misguided that it almost defies description. Children, tens of thousands of them, some accounts say, led by charismatic young preachers, set off to walk to Jerusalem, which was under Muslim control, on the grounds that God would help them succeed where the armed crusades of their parents' generation had repeatedly failed. The theory was that their purity and faith would somehow part the seas, or move the hearts of the enemy, or accomplish something that swords and siege engines had not managed. The reality was predictably grim. Many of the children got no further than the Italian coast before turning back, exhausted and hungry. Others, lured onto ships by merchants promising free passage to the Holy Land, were taken to North Africa and sold into slavery. Some died crossing the Alps. Very few of those who set out arrived anywhere near their destination. The whole episode is one of the more heartbreaking footnotes of the medieval period. A movement born of genuine faith and extraordinary naivety, swallowed by an indifferent world that had absolutely no interest in rewarding either quality. It is worth noting, before going further, that the Children's Crusade is one of those historical events that exists in a somewhat uncertain space between documented history and later legend. The medieval sources are inconsistent and sometimes contradictory, and some historians have argued that the participants were not necessarily as young as the word children implies, but rather a movement of the poor and disenfranchised, juvenes in Latin, which can mean young men rather than literal children. What does seem clear is that there were two distinct movements in 1212, one originating in Germany, led by a young man named Nicholas of Cologne, and one in France, led by a shepherd boy named Stephen of Clore. Both claimed divine visions, both gathered large followings, both ended in disaster. Nicholas of Cologne led his followers. Estimates range from a few thousand to tens of thousands, with the truth probably somewhere in the more modest middle, south through Germany, and across the Alps to the Italian coast. The crossing of the Alps alone was a catastrophe. The Alps in summer are challenging for trained and well-equipped travellers. For a mass of children and young people with minimal provisions, no military organisation, and the theological certainty that God would provide, they were lethal. People died of cold, of exhaustion, of falling, of disease. Those who made it to the Italian coast to Genoa and then Pisa found the sea stubbornly refusing to part, as the sea generally does when you stand in front of it expecting a miracle. The Genoese offered the survivors some ships, or so some accounts say. Most turned back and walked home, a journey on which many more died. Nicholas himself disappears from the historical record. Nobody knows what happened to him. The French branch fared perhaps worse in its later stages. Stephen of Clore gathered a following and marched to the port of Marseille, where two merchants, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, which are genuinely their names, and which should perhaps have been warning signs, offered 7 ships free of charge to take the Crusaders to the Holy Land. 2 of the ships wrecked in the Mediterranean, and everyone aboard drowned. The remaining 5 arrived in North Africa, specifically in Bougie and Alexandria, where the passengers were sold into slavery. Some ended up in the courts of Muslim rulers, some converted to Islam rather than face servitude, some simply vanished. The merchants who had provided the ships were later revealed to have arranged the whole thing from the beginning as a slave trading operation. The children had not even had the dignity of being betrayed by accident. They had been very deliberately betrayed by adults who saw in their faith a logistical opportunity. It is one of the more straightforwardly depressing episodes in a century that offered considerable competition in that category. The Western Front in the First World War stretched nearly 500 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border, and along its length sat what might be the most comprehensive system of human misery ever deliberately constructed: the trenches. You have probably heard of them. You probably think you have a sense of what they were like. You almost certainly underestimate it. The trenches of 1916, the year of the Somme, the year of Verdun, the year that killed more men in a shorter time than almost any other period in modern warfare, were not just difficult. They were a sustained assault on every human sense simultaneously. They were wet. They were cold. They were loud. The shelling was constant enough that men developed a particular kind of 1,000-yard stare, a look that doctors at the time called shell shock, and we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder. They were full of rats so fat and bold they stole food from sleeping men. They smelled of mud and chemical weapons and things that had once been alive, and the men in them, boys, many of them, 18 and 19 years old, went over the top when they were told to, walked into machine gun fire because an officer blew a whistle, and tried their best to stay sane in conditions specifically designed by the logic of attrition to be unsurvivable. Let's talk about mud. Not metaphorical mud. Actual, physical, particular mud. The mud of Flanders and Picardy, which is a clay-based soil that, when churned by the passage of hundreds of thousands of men and the impact of millions of artillery shells, become something more like liquid clay than anything you would ordinarily call ground. Men sank in it. Horses sank in it and could not be extracted and had to be shot where they stood. Artillery pieces sank into it and had to be abandoned. The trenches flooded regularly, and standing water sat in them for days at a time, creating a condition called trench foot, a fungal and bacterial infection of the feet caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, which in its advanced form caused the flesh to turn black and die and required amputation. Soldiers were supposed to dry their feet and change their socks twice a day. There were frequently no dry socks. There was frequently no way to dry anything. The rats were their own particular horror. They fed on the bodies of the dead which lay in no man's land between the opposing trench lines and could not always be retrieved for burial. They grew large. Accounts describe rats the size of cats, and bold, running over sleeping men, stealing food from kit bags, appearing everywhere and in quantities that no amount of killing reduced. Soldiers killed them for sport and out of hatred, but the rats were adapting faster than the killing could keep up. Lice were universal. Every man in the trenches had them, and the standard treatment was to run a candle flame along the seams of your clothing to kill the eggs, a process called chatting and done communally, which at least had the advantage of giving men something to do with their hands during the brief periods when they were not being shelled, and the shelling. It is difficult to communicate what prolonged artillery bombardment does to a person's mind. The preliminary bombardment before the first day of the Somme, July the 1st, 1916, the single deadliest day in the history of the British Army, with nearly 60,000 casualties, lasted 7 days. 7 days of continuous artillery fire designed to cut the German wire and destroy the German trenches before the infantry went over. It did neither effectively. The German trenches were deeper than anticipated. The German soldiers waited in their dugouts through the bombardment and emerged when the firing stopped, which was the signal that the British infantry was about to advance, and got behind their machine guns and waited. 57,470 British soldiers were killed or wounded on the 1st of July 1916. Some battalions were destroyed in minutes. The men who survived and wrote about it mostly said the same thing, that nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for what it was actually like. They had been told it would be straightforward. They had been told the wire would be cut. They had been told to walk. They walked. By the autumn of 1846, the blight had returned for the second year in a row, and the people of rural Ireland understood, in the quiet, terrible way you understand something you've been dreading, that this year was going to be worse than the last. The potato crop, the primary food source for more than 3 million of Ireland's poorest people, was black in the ground before it could be harvested. The stalks rotted where they stood. The fields, which should have been alive with the dense green of a good crop, were brown and stinking under skies that seemed to offer nothing but rain. What followed was one of the worst famines in European history. Over the course of 5 years, approximately 1 million people in Ireland died of starvation and related disease, and another million emigrated, a hemorrhage of population that would reshape Irish society, culture and memory for generations. To wake up in a rural Irish cabin in the autumn of 1846 thin already, children crying, digging hopefully in a field and coming up with nothing but black rot, is to understand a kind of despair that goes beyond ordinary hunger. It is the despair of a system that has failed completely, quietly, and without any mechanism for appeal. The potato had come to Ireland in the 16th century, and by the 19th it had become something considerably more than a food. It was the architecture of survival for the rural poor. A single acre of potatoes, properly grown, could feed a family of 5 for a year. The potato required relatively little labour compared to grain crops, grew in poor soil, and produced extraordinary yields in the damp Irish climate. It could be stored through winter, fed to pigs and cattle as well as people, and prepared in 100 ways. For the poorest tenants, who paid rent in cash earned through seasonal labour and lived on tiny plots of land, the potato was not a dietary choice. It was the entire diet. Adults in Connaught and Munster were eating somewhere between 7 and 14 pounds of potatoes a day, which sounds alarming but provided, along with buttermilk where available, a nutritionally complete if monotonous diet. They were, by most measures, healthier than the English urban poor of the same period, and then Phytophthora infestans arrived. The blight was a water mould, not a fungus, though it behaves like one, that had originated in the Americas and arrived in Europe in 1845. It spread with horrifying speed through the damp Irish summers, destroying potato crops not just in Ireland but across Europe. In Ireland, though, there was no backup. When the crop failed in 1845, it was devastating. When it failed again in 1846, more completely, across nearly the entire country, it was catastrophic. And here is where the political dimension of the famine becomes impossible to separate from the natural disaster. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. The British government's response was shaped by an ideological commitment to free market economics that held, with extraordinary rigidity, that state intervention in food markets was counterproductive. Food continued to be exported from Ireland throughout the famine, grain, cattle, butter, because those were market transactions and interfering with them was not, under prevailing economic theory, the government's role. The fact that people were dying in the fields while food left the country was noted by contemporaries and has not been forgotten since. You're in a one-room cabin in County Mayo. The walls are stone and the roof is thatch and the floor is earth. You have children, 3, 4, 5 of them, at various ages. Your husband or your wife is already showing the signs. The swollen belly that comes with starvation, the lethargy, the eyes that have stopped focusing on the middle distance because the middle distance offers nothing worth focusing on. You walk to the Public Works project. This morning, the British government's preferred relief mechanism, which involved paying destitute people to build roads that often led nowhere, and worked for 10 hours in the rain for wages that bought less food than you needed to survive the work itself. You came home. There is nothing in the pot. The children are quiet in the way that hungry children go quiet, past crying, past asking. Outside, the smell of rot is everywhere, rising from every field, the particular sweet-sour stench of a ruined harvest, which you will smell in your memory if you survive for the rest of your life. The potato famine did not just kill people. It broke something in the relationship between Ireland and Britain that never fully healed, and it sent the Irish diaspora to America, to Australia, to Canada, that would reshape those countries as profoundly as the famine reshaped Ireland itself. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been one of the greatest cities in the world. At the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, it was the centre of Islamic learning, science, poetry, mathematics and medicine, a city of perhaps 1 million people, of libraries and hospitals and markets full of goods from China to Spain, of scholars translating Greek philosophy into Arabic and then improving on it. It was called the City of Peace. It had a round outer wall, a palace at its centre, and a grand mosque, and it sat at the crossroads of a trade network that connected the known world. In February of 1258 CE, the Mongol army under Hulagu Khan completed its siege, broke through the city's walls, and proceeded to carry out one of the most devastating sacks in medieval history. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses according to tradition, so that his blood would not touch the earth. The libraries were burned. The canals were reportedly run red with ink from the thousands of books thrown into the Tigris. Estimates of the dead range from 200,000 to over 1 million. The great city of Baghdad, City of Peace, was reduced in a matter of days to a smouldering ruin. What had taken 500 years to build was unmade in a week, Baghdad in the mid-13th century was not the empire it had once been. The Abbasid Caliphate had been declining for generations, its political power hollowed out by Turkish military commanders called sultans, who held the real authority while the caliph retained religious prestige and ceremonial function. The city itself, though, remained extraordinary. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, had been the intellectual engine of the medieval Islamic world for centuries, the institution through which the accumulated knowledge of Greece, Persia, India and China had been translated, synthesized and extended. The scholars who worked there had made foundational contributions to algebra, astronomy, optics, medicine and philosophy. The city's libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the great repositories of human knowledge on earth. Hulagu Khan arrived in the autumn of 1257 with an army estimated at somewhere between 100 and 150,000 soldiers, Mongol cavalry, Chinese engineers who operated siege equipment, Persian infantry, Armenian and Georgian auxiliary forces. The Caliph al-Mustasim, whose advisors were catastrophically divided between those urging resistance and those urging negotiation, made the fatal error of doing neither effectively. He sent a small force out to meet the Mongols and it was destroyed. He then retreated inside Baghdad's walls and waited, apparently believing that the Mongols would negotiate, or that divine intervention would prevent the city's fall, or perhaps simply that this was not actually happening. It was happening. The walls were breached on the 13th of February 1258, and the sack began. Now imagine you're a scholar in Baghdad on that day. You have spent your adult life in the libraries, copying manuscripts, translating texts, conducting research that builds on centuries of accumulated work. The knowledge around you represents not just your life's work, but the life's work of generations of predecessors. And now men who have no interest in any of it are throwing it into the river. The historian Rashid al-Din, writing decades later, described the Tigris running black with ink from the destroyed books, then red with the blood of the scholars killed beside them. Whether this is literal or literary, the image has endured because it captures something true about the scale of what was lost. Some manuscripts were saved, smuggled out, hidden, preserved in libraries in Cairo and Anatolia and Spain, but the majority were gone. The destruction of Baghdad's libraries in 1258 is one of the great intellectual catastrophes of the medieval world, a burning of Alexandria, but faster, more complete, and thoroughly, deliberately intentional. In the summer of 1935, in parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and Colorado, the sky turned black in the middle of the afternoon. Not overcast, black. The dust storms, which had been building for years as drought and catastrophic farming practices stripped the topsoil from millions of acres of once fertile Great Plains farmland, had become a force of nature entirely their own. The Black Sunday storm of April 14th, 1935 is the most famous, a wall of dust 2 miles high, moving at 60 miles an hour, turning day to absolute night in minutes. People caught outside reported being unable to see their hand in front of their face. Static electricity built up so intensely it knocked people off their feet. Cars stopped running because their engines clogged with dust. Families stuffed rags under doors and windows and still woke to find everything in their houses covered in a fine layer of silt. This was not one bad day. The Dust Bowl lasted nearly a decade, displacing hundreds of thousands of families, killing crops, livestock and children alike with dust pneumonia, and grinding down an already depression-battered rural population to something approaching desperation. To understand the Dust Bowl, you have to understand what the southern Great Plains looked like before it, and specifically what had been done to it in the preceding decades. The native grasslands of the region, short grass prairie, resilient and deep-rooted, evolved over thousands of years to survive the cycle of drought and rain that defined the climate, had held the topsoil in place through everything the Great Plains threw at it. Then, beginning in the late 19th century and accelerating dramatically during and after the First World War, when grain prices were high and the government was actively encouraging production, farmers ploughed up the grasslands in enormous quantities. New machinery, the tractor, the combine harvester, made it possible to break vast areas of sod that would have been beyond the capacity of earlier agriculture. Millions of acres of prairie were converted to wheat fields in a generation. The deep-rooted grass that had anchored the soil for millennia was gone, and then the rain stopped. The drought that began in 1930 and persisted, with brief interruptions through the decade, was severe but not unprecedented in the Great Plains. The region had experienced similar droughts in earlier centuries. What was unprecedented was the absence of the root systems that would have held the topsoil in place while the rain was gone. Without those roots, the soil dried, loosened, and when the wind came, which it always does on the Great Plains, it went airborne. The dust storms that resulted were not ordinary weather events. They were ecological catastrophes, self-reinforcing and growing worse as each storm stripped more topsoil and left the land more vulnerable to the next one. Wake up in a farmhouse outside Boise City, Oklahoma in the spring of 1935. The farm has been in your family for 20 years. You broke this ground yourself, or your father did, with a team of horses and a plough, and the absolute certainty that hard work and good land were enough to make a life. The wheat has failed 3 years in a row. The cattle are thin. The bank has already sent letters about the mortgage that you cannot quite bring yourself to open. This morning there is a brown haze on the horizon that you've learned to read the way your grandfather read weather. It means another one is coming. You wet rags and stuff them along the windowsills. You drape damp sheets over the furniture. You bring the children inside and tell them to stay there. The sky goes dark at 2 in the afternoon, and when the storm hits, it hits like a wall, a roaring, gritty, suffocating wall that gets into everything, that you taste on your teeth and feel in your lungs for days afterward. When it passes, the fence, posts are drifted over, the tractor is half buried. The kitchen table has a 1/4 inch of fine red dirt on it, even though every gap you could find was stuffed and sealed. Outside, the fields look like a beach. The topsoil that took 10,000 years to form is somewhere over Kansas now, or falling into the Atlantic Ocean, or settling on the decks of ships 300 miles offshore, which is exactly what happened on Black Sunday. Ships at sea reported a rain of dust 300 miles from the coast. The land you bet your family's future on has blown away, and there is no mechanism, no policy, no prayer that is bringing it back this season. The winter of 1645 was not, by the standards of the Little Ice Age, particularly unusual, which is itself a damning statement. The Little Ice Age, which gripped Europe from roughly the 14th to the 19th century with varying intensity, reached one of its coldest sustained phases in the mid-17th century in a period sometimes called the Maunder Minimum, named for a significant and prolonged reduction in sunspot activity that contributed to the cooling. This was the era in which the Thames in London froze solid enough to hold frost fairs, carnivals on the ice, with stalls and sledding and oxen roasting whole. It sounds charming, and the paintings make it look charming. But to live through it, if you were a farmer in the Netherlands or a peasant in Sweden or a crofter in Scotland, was not charming. It was a grinding, relentless cold that shortened growing seasons, killed harvests, drove up grain prices, and created the conditions for famine, social unrest, and the desperate search for someone to blame, which is part of why witch trials spiked so dramatically during the coldest decades of this period. Waking up in a northern European winter in the 1640s meant waking up in a cold that had no end in sight and no explanation anyone could agree on. The frost fairs on the Thames are worth dwelling on for a moment because they illustrate the peculiar doubling of the Little Ice Age experience, the way that genuine catastrophe and strange carnival could exist simultaneously. The Thames froze in 1645, in 1648, and in several other winters of the mid-century, solid enough not merely to walk across but to support the weight of printing presses, food stalls, puppet shows, and in one memorable case, an elephant led across the river below London Bridge as a demonstration of the ice's thickness. People drank gin on the frozen river and bought novelty pamphlets printed on the ice itself. It is exactly the kind of absurdist human response to adversity. Well, if the river is frozen solid and we're all going to have a terrible winter anyway, we might as well have a party on it. That makes you simultaneously impressed by and worried about the species. But outside London, away from the spectacle of the frost fair, the cold was simply punishing. The growing season in northern Europe shortened by several weeks compared to earlier centuries, which sounds manageable until you consider that the margin between a successful harvest and a failed one in 17th century agriculture was often measured in weeks. A late spring frost could kill seedlings. An early autumn frost could kill grain that had not yet ripened. Either one, in a subsistence farming community with no ability to import food over any significant distance, was a disaster. Both at once were a famine, and the 1640s delivered them repeatedly. You're a farmer in the Dutch province of Friesland in the winter of 1645. Your farmhouse is built to the standards of the time. Heavy timber frame, thick walls, a central hearth, and it is cold inside in a way that cold inside a modern building simply is not, because there is no insulation beyond the walls themselves, and the heat from the hearth dissipates the moment you move more than a few feet from it. Your fingers ache in the mornings. The well froze in November and has not thawed. You're melting snow for water. Your livestock, the cattle that are the foundation of your farm's economy, the reason the Netherlands in this period produces extraordinary butter and cheese that is exported across Europe, are in the barn, which is attached to the house partly for their warmth, and partly so they do not freeze. They're eating stored hay at a rate that worries you. You have done the calculation. The hay runs out before the thaw arrives. You're not sure what you do after that. The crops you planted in autumn failed when the ground froze earlier than expected. The spring planting cannot happen until the ground thaws, which by the current evidence will be sometime in what optimists are calling spring, and everyone else is calling eventually. The cold is not dramatic. It is not exciting. It is simply there, every morning, a fact of existence as certain and as merciless as taxation. The Roman soldiers who came back from campaigning in the east in 165 CE brought with them something far worse than a military defeat. They brought a plague. The Antonine plague, believed by most modern scholars to have been smallpox, swept through the Roman Empire for the better part of 15 years, killing somewhere between 5 and 10 million people at conservative estimates, and possibly far more. Roman physician Galen, who witnessed it firsthand, described symptoms with clinical horror: fever, vomiting, diarrhea, a rash that began on the skin and sometimes turned into ulcers, and a smell that he tactfully noted was not pleasant. The death rate was somewhere between a quarter and a third of those infected. The army was so badly hit that the Emperor Marcus Aurelius had to recruit gladiators and criminals to fill the legions. Cities ran out of room to bury the dead. And here is the particularly eerie detail. Roman life did not simply stop. People kept going to the baths, kept buying bread, kept attending the games, because what else do you do when the world is sick and there is no explanation, no cure, and no mechanism for control beyond hoping the gods might intervene if you sacrificed enough animals? The Antonine plague gets its name from the Antonine dynasty, the line of emperors that included Hadrian, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, during whose reign it arrived and ravaged the empire. The disease came back with the Roman armies from the siege of Seleucia on the Tigris, the capital of the Parthian Empire, and the first major outbreak in Rome itself occurred around 166 CE. Galen, who was the most eminent physician of his age, and whose influence on medicine would last for over 1,000 years, was in Rome when it hit. He describes the symptoms carefully enough that modern epidemiologists have been able to make a reasonable case for smallpox. The fever, the gastrointestinal symptoms, the skin eruptions that appeared on day 9 and scabbed over. He also, it should be noted, left Rome when the epidemic became particularly severe, because Galen was brilliant and also not an idiot. Now put yourself in Rome in the winter of 166 CE. Rome at this point is the largest city in the Western world, perhaps 1 million people packed into an urban landscape of extraordinary density, with apartment buildings of up to 7 or 8 stories, a sophisticated water supply and sewer system by ancient standards, and approximately zero germ theory. The concept that disease could be transmitted from person to person by invisible agents was not part of the Roman medical framework. Disease was understood through miasma theory, bad air, originating from swamps or rotting matter, or through divine displeasure. Neither explanation offered any useful guidance for containment. You did not quarantine the sick. You sacrificed to Asclepius and hoped. The empire's response was a mixture of genuine distress and astonishing practical resilience. Marcus Aurelius, who was not only an emperor but a Stoic philosopher who wrote with great clarity about mortality and equanimity, dealt with the plague in practical terms. He organised medical relief, arranged for mass burials using imperial carts when private families could not manage, and maintained the functioning of the state through what must have been a deeply destabilising period. He also wrote in his private journal, The Meditations, never intended for publication, about the nature of suffering and the importance of continuing to act rightly regardless of circumstances. He had lost members of his own family to the plague. He kept working. The plague eventually burned through the population and faded, as plagues do when susceptible hosts run out. It left the empire noticeably smaller in population, noticeably less stable economically, and noticeably more anxious about the divine favour that the Roman religious framework said was supposed to protect it. The Antonine plague did not break Rome, but it was the first deep crack in a structure that would, over the following centuries, develop quite a few more. If there is a single conflict in European history that most comprehensively destroyed the ordinary lives of ordinary people over the longest period of time, it is almost certainly the 30 Years' War, which ravaged the Holy Roman Empire, roughly modern-day Germany and surrounding territories, from 1618 to 1648. The war began as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and became something considerably more complicated. A tangle of dynastic ambitions, foreign interventions from France, Sweden, Spain, and Denmark, and a military culture so brutal and so expensive that armies routinely sustained themselves by pillaging the civilian population. By the time the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, significant portions of Germany had lost between 1/4 and 1/3 of their population to battle, to famine, to plague, and to the particular violence of armies that had no reliable supply lines and took what they needed from whoever happened to be nearby. There are accounts from this period that read like dispatches from the end of the world. Entire towns empty, fields unploughed, roads empty except for refugees, survivors eating grass. The war's trigger, the defenestration of Prague in 1618, in which Protestant Bohemian nobles threw 2 Catholic royal governors and their secretary out of a window of Prague Castle, sounds almost farcical at this distance. All 3 survived, landing in a dung heap, which Catholic propagandists said proved divine protection, and Protestant propagandists said proved the efficacy of dung heaps. It would be the last faintly comic moment in a war that rapidly became anything but. The conflict pulled in virtually every major European power. The Habsburg emperors backed by Spain, the Protestant German princes backed by Denmark and then Sweden, France, Catholic France, backing the Protestants for purely strategic anti-Habsburg reasons, and a cast of mercenary commanders whose loyalties followed payment rather than ideology. What the war meant for ordinary Germans was the experience of armies, and there were constantly armies, moving, foraging, fighting, and moving again, that had perfected the art of living off the land. The term is almost too gentle for what it meant in practice. An army of 20 or 30,000 men descending on a region needed food, fodder for horses, firewood, billets for soldiers, and usually everything else movable and valuable. They took it. The legal and theological frameworks that were supposed to limit the conduct of war, the laws of war as understood in the 17th century, were real but unevenly applied and easily set aside when the alternative was a starving army. Villages were looted, women were assaulted, crops were burned, livestock was taken or killed, and then the army moved on, and another army arrived following the same logic. Some regions experienced this cycle a dozen times over the course of the war. Wake up in a farming village in Württemberg in the summer of 1630. You have already lived through 12 years of intermittent war. The village has been occupied twice, looted once severely enough that several families left and did not return. Your wheat is growing. It is growing well, actually, because this summer has been dry and warm and the harvest looks promising. You're calculating for the first time in several years that you might have enough surplus to pay the rent and still eat through winter, and then the scouts come through, just a handful of cavalry, moving fast, not stopping, and you know what follows scouts. You begin, with the specific efficiency of someone who has done this before, to hide things. The smoked meat goes into the floor cavity under the hearthstone. The seed grain goes into the false bottom of the grain chest. You send the cattle into the wood with the oldest boy. You tell your wife and daughters to go to the church and stay there, because soldiers sometimes, not always, but sometimes, respected the church, or at least hesitated in front of it. You're not hiding from enemies. You have no idea at this point which side the approaching army is even on. Catholic or Protestant, it barely matters. An army's an army, and what armies do to villages in the 30 Years' War has very little to do with theology and everything to do with hunger. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. Let that number settle. 872 days of a city of nearly 3 million people completely cut off from food, fuel, and supplies by the German army, which had surrounded it with the intention of starving it into surrender, rather than taking the costly step of fighting for it street by street. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the worst. The temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The city's food reserves were catastrophically low. The daily bread ration for a factory worker fell to 250 grams, barely enough to survive on. For dependents and children, it was 125 grams. People ate anything: library paste, leather, sawdust mixed into bread, the wallpaper glue that contained potato starch. They burned furniture to stay warm. They pulled the bodies of neighbours and family members through the frozen streets on sleds, because there was no other way to get them to the burial sites. Somewhere between 800,000 and over 1 million civilians died in the siege, more than the combined American and British military deaths in the entire Second World War. Leningrad in 1941 was the second city of the Soviet Union, formerly St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, renamed Petrograd during the First World War, and then Leningrad after Lenin's death in 1924. It was a city of extraordinary cultural wealth. The Hermitage Museum, the Mariinsky Theatre, universities, libraries, palaces, and the physical infrastructure of 3 centuries of imperial ambition. It was also, in the summer of 1941, a city that had perhaps 6 weeks of food supplies when the German army completed its encirclement in September of that year. 6 weeks was not enough. The only supply route into the city was across Lake Ladoga, in summer by barge, in winter, when the ice thickened sufficiently, by truck convoy along a route that became known as the Road of Life. The Road of Life saved Leningrad eventually, but it was never enough to do more than slow the starvation. Trucks broke through the ice. Trucks were bombed by German aircraft. The amounts that got through were insufficient by enormous margins through the first terrible winter. Now put yourself in Leningrad in December of 1941. You're not a soldier, you're a school teacher, or a museum curator, or a factory worker or a tram driver. The city is full of people who are simply there when the ring closed. The heating has failed because there is no fuel. You're wearing everything you own, indoors, and you are still cold. Your ration card, the system by which food is distributed, with different categories receiving different amounts, factory workers most, children and dependents least, gives you a piece of bread roughly the size of a small book. That is today's food. You're not going to eat it all at once because the hunger management skill you've developed over the past 2 months is to divide it into portions and eat slowly, chewing each piece for as long as possible because your brain, which still has some evolutionary optimism left in it, will register the act of chewing as the beginning of satiety, even when there is almost nothing to be satisfied. Your neighbours have started to look strange. The particular hollow-faced, enormous-eyed look of extreme malnutrition, which you have learned to recognise and which you suspect you're starting to wear yourself. The city did not surrender. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about the siege of Leningrad, that a civilian population enduring conditions of this extremity for nearly 900 days simply did not stop. Factories continued producing war material. The Leningrad Philharmonic performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, composed partly in the besieged city in August of 1942, broadcast on loudspeakers aimed at the German lines. The musicians were so weakened by starvation that some had to be brought in from the front lines, where soldiers were in marginally better physical condition than the civilians. The performance lasted 78 minutes. People wept. The city endured until January of 1944, when Soviet forces finally broke the blockade. The survivors emerged into a city that had lost a third of its population and had been transformed permanently and profoundly by what it had survived. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the early 16th century, they brought with them something more devastating than gunpowder or steel, diseases for which the indigenous populations of the Americas had no immunity whatsoever. Smallpox hit the Aztec Empire in 1520 CE, during the siege of Tenochtitlan, and what followed was one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in human history. The disease killed indiscriminately warriors, farmers, priests, children. The Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac himself, who died of smallpox just months after taking power. Survivors described streets full of bodies that could not be buried, entire neighbourhoods silent, people who had been healthy at dawn dead by nightfall. Estimates suggest that within a century of European contact, the indigenous population of the Americas fell by somewhere between 50 and 90%, tens of millions of people due to a combination of disease, conquest, and famine. It is a scale of death so enormous that the mind resists it. To wake up in Tenochtitlan in the autumn of 1520, watching a disease you have no name for move through your city like a ghost, was to witness the beginning of a world ending. Tenochtitlan in 1520 was by any objective measure one of the great cities of the world. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the shore by broad causeways, it was a city of perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 people, larger than any city in Spain, larger than London, larger than almost any city in contemporary Europe. It had markets so vast that the Spanish soldiers who first saw them were struck speechless. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who was there, wrote that some of his companions who'd been to Rome and Constantinople said that so large a marketplace and so full of people and so well regulated and arranged they had never beheld before. There were flower markets, gold markets, cloth markets, food markets with dozens of varieties of chili peppers, cacao, tomatoes, and foods the Spanish had no names for. The city had a zoo. It had an aqueduct. It had professional judges presiding over dedicated courts. It was, in the most straightforward sense of the word, a civilization. The smallpox arrived in the city in the autumn of 1520, carried by an enslaved African man named Francisco de Eguía, who had come with the expedition of Pánfilo de Narváez sent to confront Hernán Cortés. He died of it, and it spread from him through a population that had never encountered it, a population with no acquired immunity, no medical tradition that had any relevant experience with it, and no idea what was happening. The Aztec medical system was sophisticated within its own framework, but it had developed in response to the diseases that had historically circulated in Mesoamerica. Smallpox was not among them. The disease moved faster than understanding could follow. A Nahuatl account recorded after the conquest describes the epidemic with devastating specificity. It covered people from head to foot with sores. They could not walk, they could not move. The sick were so helpless they could only lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs, unable to face one another. And if they made a motion, they called out. The pustules covered the face, the breast, the belly. A great many people died of them, and many just starved to death. Starvation reigned, and no one took care of others any longer. The strategic consequences were profound. Cortés, who'd been driven out of Tenochtitlan in June of 1520, in what the Spanish called La Noche Triste, the sad night, returned in 1521 to find a city devastated by disease and besieged it with the advantage of an enemy that had already been half destroyed by something he had not planned and could not have. The fall of Tenochtitlan in August 1521 was not simply a military defeat. It was the collapse of a world, accelerated by a microscopic organism that cared nothing for civilizations, causeways, or the extraordinary things human beings had built on a lake in the middle of Mexico. London in the summer of 1665 had a smell, and it was not a good one. The city was, by the standards of the day, enormous. Around 400,000 people packed into a space that had no sanitation system to speak of, no clean water supply, no understanding of germ theory, and an enthusiastic population of rats that considered the place perfectly comfortable. When the plague arrived, bubonic plague, the same family of disease that had caused the Black Death 3 centuries earlier, it moved through the city with terrible speed. At the peak of the outbreak in September of 1665, over 7,000 people were dying in London every week. The city emptied of those who could afford to leave. The court fled. The wealthy fled. The doctors largely fled. Those left behind painted red crosses on the doors of infected houses and wrote, "Lord have mercy upon us," beneath them. Carts moved through the streets at night with a bell and the cry, "Bring out your dead." Not a Python joke, an actual historical practice. Bonfires were lit in the streets because people believed bad air caused the plague and smoke might clear it. They were wrong about the cause, but partially right about the effect. The fires killed some of the fleas. London in 1665 was a city enjoying a complicated recovery. The Civil War and the Interregnum, the period in which Oliver Cromwell ran the country with grim Puritan efficiency, had ended just 5 years before with the restoration of Charles II, and the mood of the city was, cautiously, celebratory. Charles, who had spent his exile in the French court and arrived back in England with considerably more sophisticated taste than his father, was popular. The theatres had reopened after nearly 2 decades of Puritan closure. The coffee houses were booming. London in the 1660s had thousands of them. Extraordinary institutions where men of different classes mixed, read newspapers, and argued about politics and science for the price of a penny cup of coffee. The Royal Society had been founded in 1660, and its members, Boyle, Hooke, Wren, and eventually Newton, were beginning to lay the foundations of what we now call modern science. It was, in other words, a city on the cusp of something remarkable, and the plague arrived into this atmosphere of cautious optimism and methodically destroyed it. The outbreak began in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, in the overcrowded slums outside the city walls, in the winter of 1664 to 65. It was slow to start, and there was some official reluctance to acknowledge it. Plague was associated in public memory with the Black Death and carried enormous psychological weight, and acknowledging an outbreak meant acknowledging that the authorities could not prevent it. By summer, it could no longer be denied. The bills of mortality, the weekly death tallies published by the city, began climbing steeply. Samuel Pepys, the diarist who is our most intimate witness to this period, recorded watching a man collapse in the street and noting the swellings, the buboes, under his arms, and walking quickly away, because there was nothing to be done and proximity was death. He also recorded buying tobacco to chew, on the theory that it might protect him, and forcing himself to smoke a pipe in the street outside a house with a red cross on the door, because he felt that if he could do something, anything, he was somehow less at risk. He was not. He survived, but not through tobacco. The plague peaked in September of 1665 and began to decline through the autumn, for reasons that were not well understood at the time and are still debated. It killed approximately 100,000 Londoners, perhaps a quarter of the city's population, before burning out. The following year, the Great Fire swept through the densely packed wooden city and destroyed much of what the plague had left standing. London rebuilt in brick and stone, and in rebuilding became a different city, more open, more planned, more Wren. The plague never returned to England with comparable force. Whether the fire helped, whether an immunity threshold had been reached, or whether the black rat population that carried the flea vector had been disrupted in ways that mattered, the end of the Great Plague of London is almost as mysterious as its arrival, and almost as unnerving. To be Catholic and Irish in the early 18th century was to exist within a legal system specifically designed to make your life as difficult as possible. The penal laws, a series of statutes passed by the Irish Parliament, which at this point represented only the Protestant Anglo-Irish establishment and certainly not the Catholic majority, restricted almost every aspect of Catholic life with extraordinary thoroughness. Catholics could not vote, could not sit in Parliament, could not hold public office, could not serve in the army, could not attend university, could not teach school, could not own a horse worth more than £5, could not buy land, could not inherit land from a Protestant, and could not practice their religion in any building with a steeple. Mass was said in the open fields, in what became known as Mass Rocks, with a lookout posted to watch for soldiers. Priests were officially banned from the country and could be transported or executed if caught. The law did not merely limit opportunity, it was engineered to dismantle a culture and an identity brick by brick across generations. The penal laws did not appear from nowhere. They were the product of a specific sequence of events. The Williamite War of 1689 to 1691, in which the Catholic King James II was defeated by the Protestant William of Orange, and the subsequent Treaty of Limerick, which promised relatively lenient terms to the defeated Catholic Irish. Those terms were, almost immediately, comprehensively ignored by the Irish Protestant Parliament, which passed the penal laws over the following decades with the specific intent of ensuring that Catholic Ireland could never again pose a political or military threat to Protestant rule. The logic was colonial and explicit. Strip away property, education, political participation, and the institutions of religious and cultural life, and you strip away the capacity for organised resistance. It was not subtle. It was not intended to be. Consider the land question, because it is where the economic consequences were most devastating. Under the penal laws, a Catholic landowner could not pass his estate intact to his eldest son. Instead, the estate had to be divided equally among all sons. System called gavelkind, which had the inevitable effect of fragmenting Catholic landholdings into smaller and smaller pieces with each generation, while Protestant landholders operated under primogeniture and could maintain their estates intact. There was also a provision that if a Catholic landowner's eldest son converted to Protestantism, he could immediately claim the entire estate over his father's head during his father's lifetime. This was not theoretical. It happened. The law was a machine for converting Catholics to Protestantism through the mechanism of inheritance. You are a Catholic farmer in County Clare in 1710. Your grandfather owned significant land. Through the operation of the penal laws, the divisions, the conversions, the inability to purchase additional land, what remains is a small tenant holding, rented from a Protestant landlord at terms that leave you enough to survive in reasonable years and not quite enough in bad ones. You cannot educate your children in Ireland. Catholic schools are banned, and the cost of sending them to school on the continent, where Irish Catholic families have maintained educational institutions since the 17th century, is beyond what you can manage. You cannot vote. You cannot hold any public office. The priest who says Mass for your community does so in a hollow in the hills on a flat stone, in the open air, with a boy watching the road and instructions to run if he sees soldiers. You're not in physical danger, precisely, on most days. The violence of the penal laws is bureaucratic and economic rather than immediately physical. It is the slow violence of a system designed to ensure that everything you do, every year you live, leaves you and your children slightly less than you were before, slightly less able to own, to educate, to participate, to matter. It is oppression with paperwork, and the paperwork goes on for a very long time. The An Lushan rebellion, which tore through the Tang dynasty in China between 755 and 763 CE, is one of the most catastrophic events in human history, and one of the least known outside of East Asian scholarship. At its peak, the Tang dynasty was the largest and wealthiest empire on earth. Its capital, Chang'an, a city of perhaps 1 million people, a cosmopolitan hub of art, trade, poetry, and governance. Then General An Lushan, a military governor of partly Central Asian origin, who had risen to enormous influence at the Tang court, declared himself emperor of a rival dynasty and led his armies south. What followed was 8 years of war so devastating that it reshaped the demographics of China permanently. The census taken before the rebellion recorded approximately 50 million people in Tang territory. The census taken after recorded somewhere between 16 and 17 million. Historians debate how much of that reflects actual death versus displacement and the collapse of record keeping. But even there, most conservative estimates suggest that tens of millions of people died from battle, from famine, from the epidemic diseases that follow war and starvation. To understand how An Lushan could bring the most powerful empire in the world to its knees in a matter of months, you need to understand the particular vulnerability that Tang military organization had developed over the preceding decades. The Tang court, to defend its vast frontiers, had created a system of powerful regional military governorships called judushi, commanders given enormous authority over both military and civilian affairs in their territories. It was an efficient solution to the problem of governing an empire that stretched from Korea to Central Asia. It was also, as it turned out, a system that made it relatively straightforward for an ambitious and capable general to build a personal power base that rivaled the emperor's own. An Lushan had done exactly that. He commanded a force of around 150,000 soldiers, drawn heavily from non-Chinese ethnic groups who were personally loyal to him rather than to the Tang court, and in December of 755 he turned that force south toward Chang'an. The Tang court's response was charitably disorganized. The Emperor Xuanzong, a brilliant patron of the arts, a man under whose reign Tang poetry reached heights it has never surpassed, the lover of the famous beauty Yang Guifei, whose story became one of the great romantic tragedies of Chinese literature, was in his 70s, had been on the throne for 40 years, and had in his later years delegated most practical governance to Yang Guifei's cousin, Yang Guozhong, who was competent at court intrigue and catastrophically bad at military command. Chang'an fell. Xuanzong fled west, and on the road his own soldiers demanded and received the execution of Yang Guozhong and Yang Guifei herself, whom they blamed for the disaster because it was easier than blaming the structures that had created it. The emperor watched his beloved die and kept walking. It is the kind of detail that Tang poets could not leave alone. Du Fu, the greatest poet of the era, spent the years of the rebellion wandering through a devastated country, writing poems about burned villages, separated families, and fields full of bones that are still read and studied today precisely because they are so specific, so exact in their grief. Now come down from the poetry to the grain. Wake up as a farmer in a Bay province in the summer of 756. Your village sits in the path of the military campaigns. First the rebel armies moving south, then the Tang loyalist forces moving north, then the rebel armies again. Each army needs food, each army takes food. The difference between a foraging army and a locust swarm is largely one of intention, and intention matters very little to an empty grain store. The summer crop was taken by soldiers in July. The autumn crop, assuming it grew at all in a season when field labour was interrupted by the need to hide repeatedly, was taken in September. By winter you're eating bark. By spring, if you survive to spring, you're eating things that a hungry person in a normal year would not consider food, and some of your neighbours are not surviving to find out what those things are. This is not an exceptional village. This is Hebei. This is Henan. This is the central plains of China in 756, 757, 758. A landscape being systematically consumed by a war that neither side was winning decisively enough to stop, while the people in between simply ran out of everything. Salem, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1691 to 1692 was a community under pressure. The colony of Massachusetts had recently had its original charter revoked and was operating under a new, less favourable one. Relations with local indigenous peoples were tense and violent. King William's War was ongoing on the frontier, and refugees from destroyed settlements were streaming into towns like Salem, bringing tales of massacres and terror. The Puritan community was experiencing what its ministers described as a spiritual crisis, a sense that God's favour was being withdrawn, that the devil was gaining ground. Into this atmosphere of anxiety and accusation came the strange afflictions of a group of young girls, convulsions, visions, an inability to pray, and the explanation that made immediate sense to a 17th century Puritan community: witchcraft. By the time the hysteria burned itself out in the autumn of 1692, 19 people had been hanged, one pressed to death under stones, and several others had died in prison awaiting trial. Over 150 people had been accused. The trials were later acknowledged to have been a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. But acknowledgement came too late for those who had already died. The girls at the centre of the Salem crisis were Betty Paris, the 9-year-old daughter of the village minister Samuel Parris, and her cousin Abigail Williams, aged 11. In January of 1692, they began exhibiting what their contemporaries described as fits, convulsions, screaming, throwing themselves into strange postures, complaining of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Other girls in the village soon displayed similar symptoms. The local doctor, William Griggs, examined them and offered a diagnosis that was medically useless but theologically devastating. He could find no physical cause, which meant, in the framework of 17th century Puritan medicine, that the cause must be supernatural. Someone was bewitching these children. The question was who? The first 3 women accused, Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados who worked in the Paris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church, were about as marginal as it was possible to be in Salem village. They had no social power, no influential connections, and no real ability to defend themselves against the accusation. Tituba, under pressure, confessed, a confession that was almost certainly coerced, and that had the unfortunate effect of validating the entire framework of the proceedings, because her confession included descriptions of meetings with the devil, a book signed in blood, and other witches she had seen who had not yet been caught. She named names. The machinery of accusation, once started, proved very difficult to stop. What is most chilling about the Salem trials, viewed from a distance of over 3 centuries, is the internal logic of the system. The court that heard the cases, the court of Oye and Termina, specially convened, admitted what was called spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted girls that they had seen the spectre, the spirit form of the accused doing harm. The accused could not effectively counter this evidence because it was by definition invisible to everyone except the accuser. Confessing to witchcraft offered a chance of survival. Those who confessed were not immediately executed, pending further investigation. Maintaining innocence while being convicted meant death. The result was a terrible incentive: lie and live, or tell the truth and hang. 19 people chose the truth. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer who refused to enter a plea, was pressed to death over the course of 2 days with heavy stones placed on his chest, the traditional English punishment for standing mute. His last words, according to one account, were more weight. Whether he said it as defiance, or whether it is simply the kind of line that gets attached to stories of unbearable stubbornness, it has endured. The trials collapsed in the autumn when the accusations began to reach people of sufficient social standing, including the governor's own wife, that the court could no longer maintain that the accusers were reliable. By then the damage was irreversible, the dead were dead, and Salem village had to find a way to live with what it had done. On the morning of August 27th, 1883, the volcanic island of Krakatoa in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra destroyed itself in a series of explosions so enormous that the loudest of them, at approximately 10 a.m. local time, was heard clearly in Australia, nearly 3,500 kilometres away, and on the island of Rodriguez near Mauritius, over 4,000 kilometres distant. It remains the loudest sound in recorded history. The explosion sent a shock wave around the Earth 7 times, detectable on barometers worldwide. The seafloor in the strait collapsed, generating tsunamis that reached heights of 30 metres in some places, sweeping away coastal towns and killing the majority of the estimated 36,000 people who died that day. The ash ejected into the atmosphere was so vast it lowered global temperatures by over 1 degree Celsius and produced sunsets so luridly strange, purples and greens and crimsons unlike anything seen before, that painters around the world tried and largely failed to capture them. Edvard Munch, standing in Oslo 2 years later, watching the aftermath still staining the Norwegian sky, described the blood-red cloud over the fjord as the starting point for a painting he called The Scream. The eruption of Krakatoa did not arrive without warning, though the warnings were not understood as such. The volcano had been showing signs of activity since May of 1883. Steam venting, minor eruptions, tremors felt on the surrounding islands. Ships passing through the Sunda Strait reported ash falls and unusual atmospheric phenomena. The Dutch colonial authorities in Batavia, the nearest major city, monitored the situation with the equipment and scientific understanding available in 1883, which was not quite enough to grasp what was coming. Krakatoa had erupted before in 1680, but not with anything approaching the force that was building in the summer of 1883. The island had been relatively dormant for 2 centuries, and the assumption, reasonable enough, given the information available, was that this was another episode of moderate activity that would resolve itself without catastrophe. This assumption was incorrect. The final sequence of explosions began on August 26th and culminated in the great paroxysmal eruption of the morning of August 27th, the one that was heard in Australia and Mauritius. The explosion had a pressure wave so powerful that it ruptured the eardrums of sailors on ships in the strait. It was caused by seawater flooding into the volcano's magma chamber as the structure collapsed, creating an instantaneous conversion of water to steam at a pressure beyond anything the surrounding rock could contain. The resulting caldera collapse generated the tsunamis, not one but a series of them, washing over the low-lying coastal towns of Java and Sumatra with speeds of up to 800 kilometers per hour in open water, slowing and rising as they hit the shallows near shore, and wiping away everything in their path with a thoroughness that the survivors, those few who reached high ground in time, described with a stunned inadequacy of language, because there are limits to what words can do with the experience of watching an entire town simply cease to exist. Now set yourself on the coast of Java on the morning of August 27th, in a fishing village whose name the subsequent wave will erase from the records along with most of its inhabitants. You heard the explosions through the night, everyone did, it was impossible not to. It was the loudest sound most people alive in 1883 had ever heard, a sound that some initially mistook for a distant naval battle. The sky at dawn is wrong. There is ash falling, a fine, grey rain of it, coating every surface, getting into your mouth. The colour of the light is strange, filtered through the particulate in the upper atmosphere into something orange and dim, like a dying lantern. And then the sea does something you have no framework for. It pulls back. Not the ordinary pull of tide. It recedes rapidly, dramatically, hundreds of meters, exposing the sea floor, stranding fish, revealing rocks that have never seen air. This is the withdrawal before the tsunami, the ocean pulling back to fuel the wave that is coming. Some people ran toward the exposed sea floor out of curiosity or to collect the stranded fish. They didn't run back in time. The people who survived were the ones who by instinct or luck or the memory of some older story turned and ran for high ground the moment the sea went wrong. They heard it before they saw it. The First World War killed approximately 17 million people over 4 years. The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people in under 2 years, possibly the single deadliest event in human history, and most people alive during it had very little idea of its scale, because censorship, wartime propaganda, and the overwhelming focus on the final months of the war kept the full picture hidden. Spain, being neutral and uncensored, reported on it freely, which is why it became known as the Spanish flu, despite almost certainly not originating there. One of its most terrifying features was that it killed the young and healthy with particular ferocity, a reversal of normal flu mortality that baffled doctors and continues to be studied today. Healthy adults in their 20s and 30s would develop symptoms in the morning, turn blue from lack of oxygen by afternoon, and be dead by evening. Hospitals ran out of beds, coffins and grave diggers simultaneously. In some cities, bodies were stacked in churches because there was nowhere else to put them, and because the war was still happening, because governments were still asking people to sacrifice and endure and not panic. Much of the dying happened in a kind of public silence, individually, in bedrooms and wards, without the acknowledgement the scale of it deserved. The pandemic moved in 3 waves. The first, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild, unusual enough to note, but not dramatically more lethal than ordinary influenza, and in the context of a world war it was easy to overlook. The second wave, arriving in the autumn of 1918, was something else entirely. It was this wave that killed with the speed and ferocity that made it historically unprecedented, and it is this wave that produced the clinical observations that still baffle researchers. The W-shaped mortality curve, in which death rates were highest not among the elderly and the very young, as influenza normally kills, but among healthy adults between 20 and 40 years of age. The leading theory is that the immune systems of healthy young adults mounted an overwhelming inflammatory response, a cytokine storm to the novel virus, and that this overreaction caused more damage than the virus itself. In effect, the people most likely to die were the ones whose immune systems were strongest. It was, from a biological standpoint, a profoundly unfair way to kill. Wake up in Philadelphia in October of 1918. Philadelphia is, at this particular moment, one of the worst affected cities in America, partly because its public health director chose to allow a massive Liberty Loan parade on September the 28th. 200,000 people crowded along Broad Street to support the war effort, against the advice of doctors who'd been watching the influenza cases climbing for weeks. Within 72 hours of the parade, every bed in Philadelphia's 31 hospitals was full. Within 2 weeks, the city was producing over 900 corpses a day, and the undertakers had run out of coffins. The city requested emergency coffin supplies from Washington. The bodies of the dead were stored on porches, in spare rooms, in any cold space available, because there was no capacity to process them. The Diocese of Philadelphia suspended the rule requiring individual burial plots, and the dead were interred in mass graves dug by steam shovels. You're a nurse at one of the city's overwhelmed hospitals. You have been working double shifts for 10 days. You have watched people come in on their own feet in the morning and die before sunset. The speed of it is the thing that undoes you, not the scale, which is too large to process, but the individual cases, the specific people. The sailor who told you he was fine, just needed a rest and was gone by dinner. The young mother who asked you to tell her husband she loved him and then could not finish the sentence. You're wearing a gauze mask that you're fairly certain is doing very little, but wearing it feels like doing something, which is important when there is almost nothing useful to be done. Outside, the streets are quiet in a way that a city of Philadelphia's size should not be quiet. The schools are closed, the churches are closed, the saloons are closed, the theatre is closed. The city has been told to avoid crowds, and the city, which watched 200,000 people parade down Broad Street 3 weeks ago, is now trying to understand what went wrong. The flu did not care about the parade. The flu did not care about the war, the Liberty Loans, the victory that was coming in November. The flu simply moved from person to person, in the breath, in the cough, in the handshake, in the air of a crowded ward, and the world it moved through had absolutely no way to stop it. For 1,000 years, the city of Constantinople had been the eastern bulwark of Christian Europe, the new Rome, the city of the Hagia Sophia, the centre of Byzantine civilization with its triple walls, its Greek fire, its libraries full of classical texts that had survived the fall of the West. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, were among the most formidable fortifications ever constructed, and they had held against sieges for centuries. Then Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, arrived with an army of between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, a fleet, and something the walls had never faced before: enormous bronze cannon capable of hurling stone balls weighing several hundred kilograms. The walls, built for a world that did not yet have gunpowder artillery on this scale, began to crack. On May 29th, 1453, after nearly 2 months of siege, the Ottomans broke through. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, removed his imperial regalia, led one final charge, and disappeared into the fighting, never seen again. Constantinople fell, and with it the last direct institutional connection to the Roman Empire. Waking up in Constantinople on the morning of May 29th, 1453, was to wake up on the last day of a civilization that had endured for over a millennium. The Ottoman siege of Constantinople began in earnest on April the 6th, 1453. Mehmed II was 21 years old. He was brilliant, well-educated in both Islamic and classical tradition, spoke multiple languages, and had made the conquest of Constantinople the central ambition of his reign from the moment he took the throne the previous year. He had also, in the months before the siege, commissioned a Hungarian cannon maker named Urban to construct artillery pieces of a size that had never been built before. The largest of these, sometimes called the Great Bombard, was approximately 8 meters long and could fire stone balls of up to 600 kilograms. It required 60 oxen and 400 men to move. It could fire approximately 7 times per day. Each shot took hours to reload. And each shot hit the Theodosian walls like nothing the Theodosian walls had been designed to withstand. The walls themselves were a marvel, triple-layered, with a moat, an outer wall, an inner terrace, and a massive inner wall in places nearly 5 meters thick and 12 meters high. They had resisted Arab sieges, Bulgarian sieges, Crusader attacks, and the passage of 1,000 years. The Byzantines defending them numbered somewhere between 7 and 10,000, a desperately inadequate force for 14 kilometers of wall. Constantine XI had sent appeals for help across Christian Europe. Some help came. A small Genoese force under the commander Giovanni Giustiniani arrived and proved invaluable, fighting with extraordinary effectiveness for nearly 2 months. A handful of Venetian ships stayed when their captains could have left. But the promised Grand Crusade that might have turned the siege never materialized. The politics of 15th century Europe were complicated, and Constantinople was far away, and by the time the walls began to crumble under the artillery, there was nothing coming from the west. The final assault came in the small hours of May 29th. The Ottomans had tried and failed twice before with direct assaults. This time Mehmed committed his full force in waves, first the irregular troops, then the Anatolian infantry, and finally the Janissaries, his elite professional soldiers, the finest military force in the world at that moment. Giustiniani was wounded early in the fighting and was carried from the walls, and his departure broke something in the defence. A small gate, the Krakatoa, was found unlocked in the confusion, and Ottoman soldiers poured through. Constantine XI, according to the accounts, threw off his imperial insignia at this point and charged into the fighting on foot, as a soldier rather than an emperor, and was never seen again. His body was never definitively identified. He simply disappeared into the last moments of Byzantium, which is, depending on how you look at it, either a tragic end or the only ending appropriate for the last emperor of Rome. In the centuries before the clearances, the Scottish Highlands operated on a system called the clan structure, a way of organising land and loyalty around extended family networks in which ordinary tenants, called clansmen, worked the land and owed military service to their chief, who in turn owed them protection and a degree of communal belonging. It was not by any measure a comfortable life. The Highlands are cold, wet and agriculturally challenging, but it was a life with roots, with community, with a sense of place that went back generations. Then the economics of the 18th and 19th centuries intruded, and the chiefs discovered that sheep were more profitable than people. The clearances, the systematic eviction of tens of thousands of Highland families from their ancestral lands to make way for large-scale sheep farming, were carried out with a thoroughness that left entire glens empty. Families were given days, sometimes hours, to pack what they could carry, and leave homes their families had occupied for centuries. Houses were burned to discourage return. People who could not emigrate retreated to the coast, where they were expected to survive on fishing and kelp, harvesting on land too poor to grow food. The Gaelic-speaking communities of the Highlands, with their poetry and music and oral tradition, were scattered across the world, to Canada, to Australia, to the slums of Glasgow, in one of the most complete cultural dispersals in British history. The economics behind the clearances were, by the cold light of early 19th century capitalism, straightforward. A Highland estate that ran cattle and supported several hundred tenant farming families generated modest rents. The same estate, converted to sheep grazing, specifically the Cheviot sheep, newly introduced from the south and producing both good wool and good mutton, could generate significantly higher returns with almost no tenants required at all. Sheep didn't need schools. Sheep didn't require the legal and social obligations that Highland chiefs had traditionally owed their clansmen. Sheep were, from the landlord's perspective, an uncomplicated improvement. The fact that the people being removed had lived on the land for generations, that their relationship to the landscape was cultural and spiritual as well as economic, that the Gaelic language and the oral traditions carried within it represented an irreplaceable form of human knowledge. None of this appeared on the ledger. The Sutherland clearances of the 1810s are the most documented and the most notorious. The Countess of Sutherland and her husband, the Marquess of Stafford, one of the wealthiest men in Britain, employed a factor, a land manager, named Patrick Seller to oversee the removal of the people from the interior straths to the coast. Seller carried out the clearances with an enthusiasm that went beyond professional efficiency. Houses were burned with people still in them, or before the sick could be removed. An elderly woman named Margaret Mackay, described in testimony as bedridden and over 90 years old, was carried out of her burning house and died shortly after. Seller was tried for culpable homicide and acquitted. The jury was composed of men who were themselves landowners with an interest in the outcome, but his name became a byword in Highland memory for the human cost of the economics he served. Wake up now in Strathnavor in the spring of 1814. Your family has farmed this glen for as far back as memory runs. The river is the same river your great-grandparents fished. The hills are the hills your grandfather described in the songs he sang on winter evenings, which you know by heart in a language, Gaelic, that carries within it 1,000 years of relationship with this specific landscape. A man arrives. He tells you that you have a few days. You look at your house, the field you ploughed last week, the kale yard, the turf stack that represents the winter's fuel, the grave of your mother at the edge of the township. You have a few days. And then you go, because the alternative is to be burned out, and you are not the first to go, and you know what happened to the ones who refused. The glen empties, the sheep arrive, the grass grows over the lazy beds where the potatoes grew. In a generation, the place names that existed only in Gaelic, that had been spoken continuously since people first settled the glen, exist only in the memories of the scattered, and then only in the memories of their children, and then they begin to go quiet. By 1937, the Soviet Union's system of forced labour camps, the Gulag, had become a vast bureaucratic machinery of suffering, stretching across 11 time zones from the Arctic north to the deserts of Central Asia. At its peak, The system held somewhere between 1.5 and nearly 2 million people at any given time, with millions more cycling through over its decades of operation. Prisoners, political dissidents, ethnic minorities, ordinary citizens denounced by neighbours for a careless word, academics, artists, clergy, and a significant number of people who had done nothing at all were sent to camps where they were expected to work in logging, mining, construction, and agriculture under conditions deliberately designed to extract maximum labour while providing minimum sustenance. Winter temperatures in some northern camps fell to -50°C. The food ration was calibrated to keep people just alive enough to work so long as they were working. Those who fell ill, who couldn't meet production quotas, who ran afoul of the camp hierarchy, faced punishments that range from reduction of already starvation-level rations to solitary confinement in unheated punishment cells, to execution. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived and wrote about the system in the Gulag archipelago, described a world with its own geography, its own language, its own laws, a shadow country built inside a country, invisible to the outside world and to most of the Soviet Union's own population. 1937 was the worst year. The Great Terror, the wave of mass arrests, show trials and executions that Stalin unleashed across the Soviet Union, beginning in that year, sent hundreds of thousands of people into the camps in a matter of months. The operational order for the mass operation, NKVD Order No. 447, signed in July of 1937, specified quota numbers for arrests and executions by region. So many people in this district to be shot, so many to be sent to camps, the numbers to be met within a fixed time period. Regional NKVD chiefs competed with each other to exceed their quotas and frequently requested permission to arrest more than their allocation, because there was career advancement in enthusiasm. The result was an arrest wave of such speed and scale that the camps, which were already at capacity, were overwhelmed. New camps were opened, existing camps expanded, the infrastructure of suffering scaled to meet the demand. Wake up as a factory engineer in Moscow in the autumn of 1937. You are, by Soviet standards, doing reasonably well. You have a room in a communal apartment, a steady job, a small amount of professional status. You're a member of the party, as most professionals were, because party membership was the price of a career. You have done nothing wrong. This detail is important, and also, in 1937, essentially irrelevant. Your neighbour was arrested last week. Your colleague at the factory was taken 3 days ago, and you do not know why, and you do not ask, because asking draws attention, and attention in 1937 is the last thing you want. You have been careful. You have said nothing. You have attended all the meetings and applauded at all the correct moments and signed all the petitions and denounced no one personally, which puts you behind, because everyone is expected to denounce someone, because denunciation demonstrates loyalty, and failure to demonstrate loyalty is itself suspicious. The knock comes at 2 a.m, which is when they always come, because 2 a.m. is when people are most disoriented and least likely to make a scene. 2 men, polite, almost formal, they have a warrant. You're allowed to bring a small bag. The camps tell you to bring warm clothing, which is the first honest information anyone gives you in the entire process. You're taken first to Lubyanka or Butyrka or one of the other Moscow prisons, and there you wait in a cell packed far beyond capacity, sleeping in shifts because there is not room for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Then the interrogation, which continues until you confess to whatever you are being charged with, because the system requires a confession and has unlimited time and very few scruples about how it obtains one. Then the sentence, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, the camps, delivered in a brief administrative proceeding that lasts approximately 5 minutes. Then a freight car packed with other prisoners heading north or east for days or weeks, then the camp. The morning roll call in the dark at temperatures that hurt to breathe in. The work quota that must be met to receive the full bread ration, but that cannot be met on the bread ration provided, which is the central mathematical cruelty of the system. The knowledge that this is not going to end soon, and the daily renegotiation with yourself about what you're willing to do and become in order to still be alive when it does. On the night of July 18th or 19th in the year 64 CE, a fire broke out in the Circus Maximus in Rome, possibly in a shop storing inflammable goods, possibly, as rumour immediately began to insist, set deliberately on the orders of the Emperor Nero, who wanted to clear space for a new building project. The fire burned for 6 days before being brought under control, then broke out again and burned for 3 more. When it was finally over, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people were homeless. Ancient temples, libraries and treasuries, irreplaceable pieces of Rome's past, were ash. Nero, whatever his actual role in starting the fire, did at least organise relief efforts. He opened the Campus Martius to displaced citizens, brought in grain supplies, and subsidised rebuilding. He also began rebuilding Rome according to a grander plan, with wider streets and firebreak zones, and constructed for himself the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an enormous pleasure palace complex that occupied a significant portion of the burnt area of the city, which did not exactly help the rumours. To live through the Great Fire of Rome was to experience the particular horror of watching the most powerful city in the world discover that it was, underneath everything, still just made of wood. Rome in 64 CE was the largest city in the Western world, 1 million people, possibly more, packed into a density that modern urban planners would look at with barely concealed horror. The insula, the apartment blocks that housed the majority of the population, were wooden-framed, multi-storey structures that could reach 7 or 8 stories in height, built right up against each other along narrow streets. There was no effective fire service, no building code with real enforcement, and no fire break system. What Rome had instead was vigils, 7 cohorts of firefighters, roughly 7,000 men in total, equipped with water pumps, buckets and hand tools, who were reasonably effective against ordinary fires and completely inadequate against a fire of the scale that broke out in July of 64. The city was a fire waiting to happen. It had been waiting for a long time. It happened on a hot, dry summer night with a wind behind it. The fire started near the southeastern end of the Circus Maximus, in a district packed with shops selling oil and other flammable goods. It spread quickly into the surrounding neighbourhood, fanned by the summer wind, jumping from insula to insula with the efficiency of a catastrophe that has found ideal conditions. By the time the vigiles arrived in force, the fire was beyond containment at its origin. The effort shifted to trying to stop it spreading, pulling down buildings ahead of the flames to create fire breaks. This worked eventually after 6 days, and then, on the 7th day, it started again, in a different district, in property that some sources identify as belonging to Tigellinus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard and one of Nero's closest associates. This detail, which may be coincidence and may not, B, is the one that stuck in the popular imagination and fueled the rumour that the second outbreak was deliberate. Nero, who was famously theatrical in his self-presentation, was at his villa in Antium when the fire started and returned to Rome to manage the crisis. The story that he fiddled while Rome burned is certainly false. The fiddle did not exist in 64 CE, and the story that he sang about the destruction of Troy from a tower while watching the flames, though reported by Suetonius, is probably embellished. What is true is that in the aftermath of the fire, Nero blamed the Christians, a small and socially marginal sect in Rome at this point, and carried out a persecution of considerable brutality. Christians were arrested, executed in the arena, and according to Tacitus used as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. Whether this served primarily as a distraction from the rumour of imperial arson, or whether Nero and his advisors had other reasons for targeting this particular group, or whether the Christians were blamed simply because they were available and unpopular, and the city needed someone to be angry at, the persecution of the Roman Christians under Nero in 64 CE is one of the earliest documented persecutions of what would become, in just a few centuries, the official religion of the Roman Empire. History does not always move in the direction you would predict from any given starting point. On the 1st of January 1804, Haiti declared independence, the first and only successful slave revolution in history, the first black republic in the world, a moment of extraordinary human defiance against a system that had treated people as property for generations. It should have been the beginning of everything. In many ways it was, but the aftermath of the revolution revealed how thoroughly the world's powers intended to punish Haiti for its audacity. France, which had lost its most profitable colony in the rebellion, sent warships and an ultimatum: pay an indemnity of 150 million francs, eventually reduced to 90 million but still an astronomical sum, in exchange for diplomatic recognition. Haiti, which had no money, took out loans to pay this indemnity to the country that had enslaved its people. It did not finish paying until 1947. The United States, which had its own complex reasons for fearing a successful Black Republic next door, refused to recognize Haitian independence for nearly 60 years. Trade embargoes, diplomatic isolation, and the crushing weight of debt followed Haiti from its very first day of freedom, ensuring that a nation born from one of history's great acts of courage would spend the next 2 centuries fighting for survival in conditions its neighbours worked carefully to maintain. Saint-Domingue, as Haiti was known under French colonial rule, had been the most profitable colony in the Americas. It produced roughly 40% of Europe's sugar and more than half of its coffee, extracted from the labour of approximately 500,000 enslaved people under conditions of extraordinary brutality. The life expectancy of an enslaved person in Saint-Domingue was short enough that the colony needed constant importation of new enslaved Africans simply to maintain its workforce. The mortality rate from overwork, disease, and violence was that high. The colonial system was maintained by the violence of the Code Noir, the French legal code governing slavery in the colonies, and by the practical violence of the plantation owners and their overseers, who had learned that fear was cheaper than any other form of labour management. It was a system built on the explicit assumption that the people at its base were not fully human, and therefore their suffering did not count. The revolution began in earnest in August of 1791 with the Bois Caimon ceremony, a gathering in the northern mountains in which enslaved people gathered and, in a ceremony that combined African spiritual traditions with the practical business of revolt, launched a coordinated uprising across the northern province. Plantations burned, enslavers were killed. The scope of the uprising was unlike anything the colonial authorities had faced, and it did not stop. It survived French attempts at suppression, a British invasion, and Napoleon's attempt in 1801 to send an army to retake the colony and restore slavery, an army that was destroyed not by the Haitian forces alone, but by the combination of Haitian resistance and an outbreak of yellow fever to which the European troops had no immunity, and the Haitian fighters, many of whom had grown up in the Caribbean, largely did. By 1804, after 13 years of revolution, the colony was free and the Republic was declared. Now, arrive in the aftermath. You're a Haitian farmer in 1810, 6 years into the Republic's existence. The revolution was won. The enslavers are gone. The land, the question of the land, who owns what the plantations occupied, has been partially resolved through redistribution, though incompletely and unequally. and the Republic is already under the weight of the indemnity. Haiti's government borrowed the money to pay France from French banks, at interest, which means that the Haitian state is paying France for the privilege of having freed itself, and it is paying French financial institutions for the privilege of borrowing the money to do so. This debt, serviced for over a century, starved the Haitian state of the resources it needed to build schools, roads, hospitals, and the infrastructure of a functioning modern nation. The United States, which could have been a natural partner, a republic in the Caribbean that had thrown off colonial rule, had it not been for the unfortunate detail that the Haitian Revolution terrified American slaveholders, maintained a trade embargo and refused diplomatic recognition until 1862, which was itself not coincidence in timing. The isolation was not accidental. The poverty was not inevitable. It was produced deliberately and methodically by nations that understood that a successful Black Republic was an argument they could not afford to let stand, and spent a century and a half making sure it would not stand too comfortably. Pompeii gets most of the attention. Pompeii is the famous one, frozen in ash, preserved in extraordinary detail, a monument to the terrible swiftness of the catastrophe. But the neighbouring town of Herculaneum, which was smaller, wealthier, and slightly more upwind of Vesuvius, experienced the disaster in a way that was, if anything, even more sudden and more complete. While Pompeii was buried under metres of ash and pumice over the course of many hours, giving some residents at least the chance to attempt escape, Herculaneum was struck by a pyroclastic surge, a superheated wave of gas and volcanic material moving at hundreds of kilometres an hour at temperatures of several hundred degrees Celsius. Death was, by the grim mercy of physics, essentially instantaneous. The people of Herculaneum who had taken shelter in the boat chambers on the beach, hundreds of them, huddled together, perhaps believing they would wait out the worst and then make their escape, were found exactly where they died, sitting, crouching, holding each other, their bones turned red by the heat, their skulls sometimes exploded by steam. They had perhaps 30 seconds of warning. They spent it the way most of us would, together, hoping it would pass. Herculaneum was not Pompeii's poor relation. If anything, it was the wealthier of the two. A seaside resort town on the Bay of Naples, a place where prosperous Romans built vacation homes with sea views, mosaic floors, and libraries stocked with philosophical texts. The Villa of the Papyri, named for the extraordinary collection of papyrus scrolls found within it, over 1,800 of them, the only library to survive from antiquity, gives a sense of the kind of wealth and intellectual life that characterized the town. It had a population of perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 people, smaller than Pompeii, more compact, more uniformly prosperous. Its streets were paved, its houses had running water, its public baths were elaborate. It was, in the most ordinary sense, a very nice place to live. The first day of the eruption, August the 24th, was hard on Herculaneum but survivable for many of its residents. The town was upwind of Pompeii relative to the initial eruption column, which meant that much of the heavy pumice fall went toward Pompeii and Stabiae rather than Herculaneum. The darkness, the ash, the distant roar of the mountain, all of this was terrifying, but for most of that first day Herculaneum was not being buried at the rate that Pompeii was. Many residents used this time to flee. The roads leading north out of town were presumably jammed, people grabbing what they could carry, moving away from the mountain. Some stayed, either unable to leave, unwilling to abandon their homes, or simply uncertain whether flight or shelter was the wiser choice, which is a calculation that is very difficult to make correctly in real time when the situation is unprecedented. Those who stayed, or who returned to shelter in the boat chambers on the beach after the initial chaos, perhaps hoping that ships would come for them, perhaps simply unable to think of anywhere else to go, were in the boat chambers when the pyroclastic surges came. The surges, which began arriving at Herculaneum in the early hours of August the 25th, moved at speeds and temperatures that left no margin. The first surge deposited a layer of material over the town. The second, third, and subsequent surges buried it deeper, until Herculaneum lay under approximately 20 meters of volcanic material, so deep that it was not found, not properly excavated, not understood as a town rather than a geological feature, until the 18th century, when a well digger near the modern town of Ercolano broke through into a marble floor, and the long, complicated, often destructive process of its excavation began. The boat chamber victims were found beginning in the 1980s in a systematic excavation that is still ongoing. They lie where they fell, in postures that suggest the instantaneous nature of their death. Some appear to have been sitting upright, some crouching against the walls. One man lay across a boat, perhaps trying to push it out. The heat was so intense and so sudden that the soft tissues of the body vaporized almost instantaneously, leaving the bones behind in their last positions, the skulls sometimes cracked from the rapid expansion of brain fluid. Among them, archaeologists found a soldier, identified by his equipment, a sword, coins, a carpenter's toolkit, lying face down, a woman clutching her jewellery, a child. The bones of a horse were found above them, on what had been the beach, positioned as if rearing in panic at the moment the surge arrived. It takes a particular kind of courage to look at those bones and not look away. They were people who had no time. They were in the wrong place when the mountain decided it was finished, and the mountain gave them no warning and no mercy, and no time to be anywhere else. The beach at Herculaneum is a quiet place now. The sea is still blue, and 20 meters below the modern town, in chambers that were sealed for nearly 2,000 years, the last day of Herculaneum is exactly where it was left, and so here we are. At the end of a very long journey through the absolute worst that history had to offer, and history, as it turns out, had quite a lot to offer. You've woken up in civilizations that simply stopped one morning without leaving a forwarding address. You've stood on the shores of a bay while a mountain unmade a city in an afternoon. You've watched the Nile refuse to flood, watched the Thames freeze solid, watched the sky turn black in the middle of July. You've been in the trenches, in the siege, in the famine, in the camp. You've smelled the rot in the potato fields and the ink in the river, and the ash falling on a fishing village before the sea pulled back and the wave came. You've been in the boat chambers at Herculaneum, watching the mountain decide it was finished. And through all of it, every collapsed empire, every failed harvest, every plague that moved faster than understanding, every winter that simply refused to end, people were there. Ordinary, stubborn, bewildered, frightened, occasionally heroic, frequently exhausted people, getting up every morning into circumstances that would have broken most of us before breakfast, and somehow finding a reason to keep going. The farmers replanted. The scholars copied the surviving manuscripts by hand and started again. The Leningraders played Shostakovich to the German lines, while the city starved. The Haitian revolutionaries won a war that by every reasonable calculation they should not have been able to win. The monks of Lindisfarne, after the longships left, came back and rebuilt. This is the thing about history that gets lost when we reduce it to dates and disasters. It is not a record of catastrophes, it is a record of what people did after the catastrophes. The resilience is not separate from the suffering, it comes out of it, slowly, imperfectly, at enormous cost, and usually without anyone involved knowing whether it is going to work. The Bronze Age survivors did not know that what they were living through was a dark age with an end. The people of Salem did not know that the hysteria would burn itself out in a matter of months. The Irish tenant farmer watching the blight come back did not know that the diaspora his children became would one day reshape the world. They just kept going. Not because they were special, or because history had promised them a good outcome, but because keeping going is what people do when they have no better option, and sometimes, in the keeping going, something extraordinary happens. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed with its clean sheets and its entirely reasonable number of parasites, which is to say none, take a moment. Not a dramatic moment, not a grand gesture of gratitude toward the cosmos, just a quiet acknowledgement that the hot water coming out of your tap, the roof holding the weather out, the fact that you can read words on a screen without a lord telling you whether you're allowed to, these things are the accumulated result of every generation that came before you, surviving something they didn't expect. The Tang dynasty farmers, the Pompeii baker whose bread was still in the oven, the Highland family that was given a few days and packed what they could carry, they are the reason you are here, in this bed, in this moment, warm and safe and watching history from a very comfortable distance. History is not a warning, it is not a lesson exactly. It is more like a very long letter from everyone who came before, written in ash and ink and bone and song saying, "We were here, it was hard, and we kept going anyway. So can you. Sleep well."